Welcome to the Releaf podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and breakthroughs shaping the future of medical cannabis. I'm Graham Woodward, Chief Operating Officer here at Releaf. And today we're joined by one of the world's leading cannabinoid researchers, Professor Saoirse O'Sullivan. Saoirse is a pharmacologist whose groundbreaking research has advanced our understanding of how cannabinoids interact with the body, from gut and heart health to inflammation and pain. Saoirse has worked at the cutting edge of cannabinoid science in both academia and industry, and today she's helping shape how evidence translates into real-world patient care. In this episode, we explore how clinics like ours can apply her insights to deliver safer, more targeted and more effective treatments, and what the future of cannabinoid medicine might hold. Saoirse, your work has shaped how we understand the endocannabinoid system. Can you tell us, for our listeners, how that impacts our patients and how we can design our treatments specifically using your research?
Wow, that's a big question. Okay, so the endocannabinoid system, I think probably I'll start there just to explain to listeners what it is. For a long time, people didn't know how cannabis works in the body, and it was just thought that maybe there was a non-specific action of cannabis products on the body. But people were like, no, I think that there's probably some kind of specific receptor that cannabis-based chemicals bind to. So they started looking for it. And it must be, it's nearly 30 years ago now that they discovered that there are specific proteins in our body that the cannabis active ingredient, which is THC, binds to. And that was the beginning of the discovery of the science of cannabinoids and that whole system and how cannabis acts in our body and the receptors it acts at. These are proteins on the outside of cells, and all of the kind of biological responses became known as the endocannabinoid system. So what was really important as a scientist was being able to, for the first time, describe why cannabinoid compounds work and that it wasn't that there was a science behind it. So from my perspective as a scientist who's been kind of working in this field for nearly 25 years now, it was amazing to be able to, for the first time, say, well, look, there is a science behind here. There is a specific mechanism of action, and we understand how these molecules work. And so that kind of, I think, took a bit of the stigma away from cannabinoid-based medicines, and really led to the development of where we are today and being able to prescribe medications in your clinics. You know, I think without that knowledge, we'd still be very far behind in our understanding.
And at Releaf, how can we use that research or that evidence to design individual patient-specific treatment plans?
What we've learned through science is we've learned what are the receptors that are important for different aspects of how cannabinoid molecules act. And so when you understand that, then you can start to tailor your medicines. So if you know a particular symptom is mediated by, for example, the cannabinoid 1 receptor, the CB1 receptor. So we know through science that that's the thing that stimulates appetite. So if you want to, in a patient, promote their appetite and get them eating more, for example, if they maybe have cancer and they're wasting from some kind of disorder, then you know what I need is something which activates CB1. And THC does that. So tetrahydrocannabinol does that. We know that for sure through science. We know CB1 is really important in pain as well. So that's why THC works in pain. And the more we understand how these molecules work, the better we can able to tailor which specific compounds are good for which specific indications.
At Releaf, we have THC, CBD and CBG. What other compounds should we be looking at when we're prescribing for individual patients with obviously complex illnesses?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because obviously the cannabis plant is made of hundreds of compounds, all of which have a very unique pharmacological profile. And I'm a pharmacologist, which means I study how drugs work. And so for me, each one of those compounds represents a potential new medicine, because they don't all act the same. I think people probably know THC and CBD quite well. If you look at the literature, they are the compounds that are most studied. Now, with the caveat that people have only really been looking at CBD for about 15 years. So that's the new kid on the block. Cannabigerol, you mentioned CBG, that's the even newer kid on the block. Those, a couple of things to say. So those lesser, we call them the minor phytocannabinoids because in the plant they're expressed in very low levels. We don't know as much about them. So, in all honesty, from a scientific perspective, there's way less research out there on those lesser known compounds. But we are beginning to learn things, and partly that's through clinics that prescribe them. So there are others out there that are interesting. So cannabinol is one that has a reputation for being good for sleep. THCV, tetrahydrocannabivarin, that's a compound that I've personally worked on in the past. So I did a clinical trial with GW quite a number of years ago where we looked at that compound in diabetes, in patients with type 2 diabetes. At the time, we investigated it because THCV, that's what it's called, was thought to be a bit like a CB1 antagonist, so a CB1 receptor blocker. So we know that CB1 activation stimulates appetite, CB1 blocking suppresses appetite, and that might be good in metabolic conditions. And that was already exploited by Sanofi. They actually developed a CB1 receptor antagonist. That failed. We can go into that if you want to. There's a new one on the block that's just been taken up by Eli Lilly. But the plant makes one. The plant makes THCV. And so we did research on whether it might be useful in diabetes. There's CBC, cannabichromene, that's quite interesting. There's some, novel information coming out about it maybe having some neuroprotective effects. There are many of them, and I think they will all have their place, but we're still quite early in terms of where we are in our scientific knowledge about what they do and what they're going to be good for. But I think one of the ways that we can learn that is through gathering all of the real world evidence from people who are having these compounds prescribed. And in cannabis-based medicines, this is often how we work. We work retrospectively to normal drug development. Normally, you develop a drug for a condition, whereas in the cannabis world, we look at what anecdote tells us. So the earliest anecdote was it works in spasticity, it works in people who have MS. That led to the development of the Sativex medicine. We learned that it works in children with drug-resistant epilepsy through people prescribing CBD in epilepsy in California. That led to the development of the Epidiolex drug. So we're learning through anecdote and people using these compounds, and then we go and, do the research to find out, well, how does that work? Why does that work? Can we do the clinical trials and prove it works and, get that into mainstream medication?
And that's hugely important, obviously, when we're looking at the safety of our patients and we're looking at other formulations or other cultivars to add to our formulary.
Yeah.
We often talk about start low, go slow. With the knowledge that you have, do you think that's the best way to be or the best way to start any treatment plan?
So I think that phrase is not unique to cannabis. I think it's specifically important for people who are taking THC because we know that not everybody has an agreeable reaction to THC. And it's best to do it low and slow and allow people to acclimatize to the sensation of what THC can do to you. And some of the symptoms of THC that people don't like your heart racing a little bit or feeling dizzy or stomach disturbances, we develop tolerance to those things with repeated use. So there's lots of benefits to starting low and going slow that just make you adapt to the medication better and allow you to kind of get up to a dose that's tolerable for you, but also works for you.
Going on to your data-led, you've crossed academia and pharma and biotech. Yeah. What could we learn as, not just as an industry and as a treatment provider, from your experience across those industries?
So I would say follow what pharma are doing. Keep a close eye on what pharma are doing. There are a lot of pharma companies and biotech companies developing medicines that are based around the science of cannabinoids, about how we understand cannabinoids work in our body and using that knowledge to develop medicines. There are a lot of companies out there. developing medicines and doing clinical trials. And I think that's really going to guide the medical cannabis world as well, because the more that pharma world do and prove, okay, this is good for this and this is good for that, then there is a plant option possibly for that as well. And also, I think it gives a lot of credibility just to the whole, we all benefit from good clinical trial data, and it increases confidence, it increases clinical confidence that this is not snake oil. There is a science behind it. There are controlled clinical trials that prove that CBD is good in epilepsy. You can't dispute that. It's the only thing we can really say we have hard clinical evidence on. So I think the more that we do that, the more there is a glow effect for everybody. And so understanding what pharma are doing, I think could be very beneficial to clinics to go, okay, or a new indication has come out. Pharma are interested in kidney disease. Why are they interested in kidney disease? What could we be doing that could be beneficial there? So I think it's keeping an eye on what are we learning about the science from pharma world, and what are we learning about the indications that cannabinoids could be good for from pharma world as well. So
how would we gain access to that, do you think?
Well, a lot of it is publicly available. I spend a lot of my time on clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website. So all clinical trials have to be registered on this government website. There's a different one in Australia. So if you want to follow the Australian research, you've got to use a different website, but clinicaltrials.gov pretty much covers all clinical trials in the UK and the US. You can just go on there and look at what anybody is doing in this world. Just use some good key terms. If you're interested in just cannabidiol, put in cannabidiol, look at who's doing phase 2 or phase 3 interventional clinical trials. You'll find out all about it, all the information about, the patients that they're looking in, what are their inclusion-exclusion criteria, like who maybe will benefit from this more than not, what kind of doses are they using, what are they measuring as their endpoints, what do they think is going to be benefited, why are they testing in that clinical population, who are the sponsors, who are the companies that are doing it. So all that information is publicly available. I also keep just a good eye on the news, so pharma news, who's being bought, who's being sold, what's hot, what's not, what's been dropped, what clinical trial data came out positive, what clinical trial data came out negative. I think that's really important to see, where do cannabinoids not work? We can't, they're not the cure-all for everything. And I think the more as a community we understand exactly what works for what and what doesn't work for what, then again, the greater confidence will be built in the industry. And if you can put your hand on your heart and say, actually, no, this isn't going to work. THC is not going to work for, I don't want to say something because I don't want to bias anything. But, if there's a particular indication for which something hasn't worked, it's really important that, you keep an eye on that and go, hold on, now this randomized controlled trial that did everything it should do and at the right doses didn't see a benefit. So maybe we shouldn't be prescribing in that area anymore. Maybe we should be looking at an alternative. Or it did work, and maybe this is a new area that we should be thinking about prescribing more or, talking to patients about.
Our listeners will have already heard me mention this, but at Releaf, we've just introduced 15 validated screening tools into our platform, such as EQ5D, 5L, GAD7, ISI, and we're capturing that data, and we're working... Again, apologies to our listeners, but we're working with Johns Hopkins about sharing data because they're doing a very similar project. Is that interesting to you? Would this be something you'd want to get involved with and support?
Yeah, I mean, the more data we gather, the better. I mean, we have to understand what's good for what, and I'm going to just keep saying that. The problem when you look retrospectively on the literature with medical cannabis is everything's lumped in together. It's all medical cannabis, one umbrella, as if it's one thing. But medical cannabis is 100 different things. What are the doses? What were the routes of administration? What did you actually give your patient? We can't tell that from the literature so far. So when people say, oh, medical cannabis doesn't work, and I'm like, I don't think that's true. Okay, you might say medical cannabis, it depends on which side of the line you fall, but some systematic reviews say it doesn't work for pain. Some say it does work for pain. But they're all relying on this same literature base, all of the published trials that have been done to date, that have used a multitude of different products through different routes of administrations in different types of pain. Now that's like just putting everything in, like, and just a whole load of noise and expecting there to be an answer at the end of it. Whereas what we need to do going forward is say, right, that's done. We can't do anything. We can't change that. We'll never know what they actually took. But going forward, we can. Going forward, you can keep a really good database about exactly what a patient is taking, how often, how are they taking it, did they change their medication at any point during the route? What else were they on? Like, what other meds were they on? Was there a drug interaction there? There's so much data that we need to record so that we find out exactly what's good for what.
Yeah, we're working on another study with Leeds University where we're looking at 150 patients with long COVID. We're going to be prescribing them an oil, and we're going to monitor them over 6 months and see whether it affects the symptoms of their long COVID. And that is really exciting. It's just going through IRAS at the moment, so ethics at the moment. We also invest very heavily in staff education and clinician education. Where do you see the value, or what could we do more than we're currently doing?
Busting some of those myths, going back to the real data, doing some real critical analysis of what's hot, what's current. This is a world where there is just so much research going on in the whole cannabinoid space, and just keeping up to that, up to date with that literature, is a massive task. So I think, I think there's always continuous professional development you can do in this area. It's great that you're already doing education, and I think it's really important to keep up with that and address some of the myths that are out there, and maybe try and get the real answers out there. Like, how do we go about re-educating people on some stuff that has become fact but never really was, fact based on fiction, in my opinion.
So you talk about myths, the entourage effect. Is that a myth or is that fact?
Oh, that's great. So I call it the entourage hypothesis because to me, it has yet to be proven. And so I think a lot of people talk about it as if it is a well-established fact that it is better to use a whole plant product than an isolated product. But there is no evidence base for that. And so for me, that will always look at the evidence base for something. There may be anecdote and people may have found that, a whole plant product has worked better for them than an isolate. But that's anecdote and that's not hard science. And so when you look at the literature to say, is a whole plant product better than an isolated product? There are no head-to-head studies. And this is something that I think in cannabinoid medicine that I would love to see more of, is head-to-head comparisons. Like, what if you take a pure CBD product and put it up against a CBD extract that has lots of other of the cannabis plant chemicals in there, do you, in a head-to-head comparison, see any difference in either the symptom relief or the side effect profile? And I think when you show me that data, then I'll believe in entourage.
Do you think there's a future for synthetic cannabis compounds?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that we know that purified cannabis compounds work, have therapeutic benefits. So I see no reason why you can't use synthetic versions of those compounds like THC and CBD. And I think in the future, if we're going to start prescribing to really big patient populations, then we may need to think of alternative sources of these compounds other than the plant. So yes, I think there is. And I think that, history shows us that we turn plants into medicines. There's a lot of parallels between other plant-based medicines like aspirin, started off being used historically as salicylic acid, and then was developed, modified a little bit, changed the structure of the molecule a little bit to make aspirin, and it's now synthetically produced at very large scales. Aspirin is very widely used across the world. And so I think, in the future, that could be somewhere that we end up going with cannabis-based medicines.
Where do you see cannabinoid treatment going in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. I'm personally quite excited by the future of cannabinoid-based medicines. I think that there's a lot of development going on. So in the pharmaceutical world, people who are trying to develop approved medications based on cannabinoid science, and then also in the cannabis medicine prescribing world, where there is so much more prescribing going on now and so much more collection of real world data. So together, what that's doing is in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a much bigger evidence base on the patient effects of cannabinoid medicine. We're going to know a lot more in the next 5 to 10 years than we've done in the last 30 years, and hopefully with better data. So better clinical trials, better knowledge of what people are actually taking.
And how can Releaf become best in class or continue to be best in class with those developments?
I think I'd like to see a clinic where they embraced both sides of the world. I think sometimes in this space there can be a little bit of division between plant-based products and pharmaceutical-based products. I think that's unnecessary. I think that we're all trying to do the same thing, which is benefit patients. And there are different ways to do that. And there are different ways that are more appropriate for some patients than others. And I think acceptance of that and embracing all of the products that are available to a patient and making them all, telling them, right, you can do this, or you can do this, or you can do this. I think that would make a really novel clinic where you're saying we're not just based on the plant, we believe in the science of cannabinoids. And so that means as a patient, you have the choice. Would you like a plant-based product? Or would you like an isolated phytocannabinoid that we think is good for your indication? Or would you like this approved medicine that has done, that has been shown through clinical trials to be good for X, Y, and Z? And then it becomes about patient choice and autonomy. And you're giving people the tools to say, look, we think all probably work, but here's the information. You decide what you want to do. And I think that would be a great clinic. You're not just about the plant, you're about the science.
Saoirse, what excites you the most about cannabinoid research?
So I think the most exciting thing for me is the never-ending possibilities of what we might be able to do in this space, because there are so many plant compounds, there are so many strategies to kind of harness what we know about cannabinoid science. There are so many diseases and patients that we could potentially be benefiting. So there is a never-ending source of research and potential outcomes, in my opinion, working in this space. I can't see where this ends. So that's probably the thing that excites me most. And I guess from a clinic perspective, that means that you can harness that. Yeah. And there is, really no end to the potential of where we can go with this. It's literally the tip of the iceberg, to use that old metaphor, but it really is, because we will just keep learning and just keep developing the more data that we gather. So that's exciting, because there's an awful lot of diseases and patients out there whose needs are not met through either because there are no prescribable medications for that indication, or because the medications that are there, that exist aren't great and have not very tolerable side effects. So, there's so many unmet needs that a cannabinoid-based medicine can potentially fill, and a cannabinoid-based clinic can potentially prescribe to patients. So that's what excites me the most and keeps me in my job.
Saoirse, it's so inspiring listening and talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to Saoirse for sharing her deep insights and helping us think more critically and more compassionately about how we deliver cannabis-based medicine. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to learn more about how we're raising the standards in cannabinoid care, visit us at relief.co.uk and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. At Releaf, we're committed to evidence-based care, continual learning, and a future where every patient gets the relief they deserve safely, respectfully, and with science on their side.